We talked about this a little bit when we were just comparing GraphQL and REST earlier, but that is that caching GraphQL is definitely harder than REST in the sense that REST has clear, it should, if you build your API somewhat correctly, at least use Git and Post, which I think most do. There's clear places where you can do caching. For instance, if you do a Git request in REST, you can feel pretty confident that you can cache that for some period of time. If you do have a table that's changing a lot or an endpoint where the data behind it's changing a lot, you might not want to cache that for too long, but there are like clear places where you can go cache data in REST. With GraphQL, everything is behind a post request. So you have to look into the body of the request to decide if you can cache it or not. Right. So that gets a little more complicating, especially if you want some granular caching. Like I want to cache posts, but this other CPT I may not want to cache as often. Like that can get pretty hairy, I would think.
Yeah, I think the simple cache that I built, that was like the first thing I did for my GraphQL API long ago. The first one I ever built was I looked at the query that came through, matched it to know that it was a query and not a mutation or some other sort of thing. And at that point, I just like took the whole query, created a cache with that as the key, like some sort of hash of that, but like the hash of that was the
huge
key.
blob of GraphQL.
Yeah. The hash of that was the key, and then and put that behind. But unfortunately, without going into the AST and figuring out all the different pieces involved in that query, every time you made a mutation request, I had to essentially delete that cache. So it's like it worked well until there was a mutation. In that API, it just so happened that there not a lot of mutations were made, or at least most of the ones that were being made I was able to separate them out. But yeah, that was like the very rudimentary cache and way to cache GraphQL.
Yeah, and it should be noted here, like it's possible to fire off GET requests for GraphQL, and that would leverage the browser's built-in caching that we were talking about that REST can leverage. So that is a possibility. I have seen people though in the WordPress space. I've seen people in the WPGraphQL Slack attempt to do that, send requests as GET requests, and get back the URI too large error message just because they have a deeply nested query and they're hitting the maximum number of characters actually allowed for URLs. So that makes me a little nervous there, just kind of relying on that. In my experience, post requests, like that's the convention in the GraphQL world that everyone uses. And with that, you often need some kind of helper library of some kind for caching. So popular options would be Apollo Client or React Query in the React world. And they do a lot of the stuff that Will was mentioning, where they'll recognize like what operations being fired off, what variables are being passed, and have we done this before? If so, return that data from memory if it's still valid, rather than getting it from the network. So you'll more often than not, in my experience, have to lean on one of these libraries to help out with that caching.
Yeah, you can do more stuff client-side caching for sure. A lot harder to do it, globally for the entire site.
Yeah, on the server side, you have to. I mean, you can cache individual entities. So in your resolvers, you can set up caches behind each resolver and that sort of thing. But obviously, it gets complicated. But REST is not uncomplicated either, because in REST, yes, your GET endpoints return the same data every time, or like the same data schema. But your post and put and patch and delete requests, they work on individual entities, or however you coded it, but they don't map one-to-one with your GET endpoints, right? So caching is always an issue there. But with REST, you do get that out of the box browser/client caching.
Yeah,
I see you're not a REST purist.
Before we leave this topic too, I'll just mention that on the server side, if you have some kind of a persistent object cache, that works great with either of these options. So if you have a REST centric app and you have an object cache like Redis or memcached or something running on the server, where rather than doing raw database queries every time, it'll remember some of those queries, it'll hold them in memory and return that quicker. That works great for either of these options.
Yeah, I feel like we conflated a lot of different types of caching into this one discussion. So good luck figuring that out. Literally every type of caching all over. Oh, all right, cool. Yeah. That's caching. I think that we can say that REST is easier there, but still going to use WPGraphQL. There's too many other benefits, right? So. All right, this is one that I think is kind of a strange one, but we brought it up in the pre-show discussion, which is file uploads. File uploads are just like a pain no matter what. So I think that the fact that this is difficult is just, it's difficult in general, file uploads, like how to manage them and then relate the file upload to the data that you want it to be related to. But GraphQL definitely doesn't have any great solution for this out of the box, right?
Yeah. So with file uploads, you're inherently dealing with a multi-part form data request. And that means that with your default GraphQL API, which is accepting post requests, they're not built to handle multi-part form data by default. And not all REST APIs are either. So there are a couple of options that people use when it comes to REST, and that is to have a single endpoint for doing file uploads, and then you have your other endpoints. So your file upload endpoint will return some ID or some way to identify your upload, and then your other endpoints will just take in that identifier. Another mechanism that people use is they just allow multi-part form data on the REST endpoint that needs the file. I typically don't go that route because it's nice to be able to limit people and limit the size, and it's nice to be able to handle file uploads in some sort of centralized endpoint. But with GraphQL, there might be a way to do it, but it's not built into the spec. So typically what I've seen people do is they have an endpoint to upload the file. They get that unique identifier, and then they make a GraphQL mutation or something.
Mm. Yeah. So what we're talking about here, as these guys said, is file uploads. So like in the WordPress world, if you're using WPGraphQL, it actually can upload files if they exist at a URL somewhere on the web. So if you have some remote image or something and you want to import that into your WordPress media library, support for that exists currently. But what you can't do, unfortunately, is have a user submitted image. So if you have a form where it's a job application, let's say, the person has to fill in some text fields, and maybe there's a resume file attachment field where they have to attach a PDF or whatever. In the ideal scenario, you would be able to fire off one mutation to your GraphQL endpoint and send all of that as multi-part form data, including saving that file to the media library. Support for that at this moment doesn't exist, which is a bummer. I'm happy to say, though, a proof of concept exists for adding that to WP-GraphQL. So that's on the roadmap. I think over the course of the next several months, like there will be a solution for doing that. For me, in my headless apps, it's been a pain point. Like I was developing the WP-GraphQL for Gravity Forms extension for WP-GraphQL, and the fact that I could submit back to the server all of these form fields in a single request, except file uploads, was a pain. It's like, well, I'm going to send one REST request for the file, and I have to store that somewhere temporarily, and then fire off the rest. And then once the entry is created, remember the ones associated with the other, and what if the network connection gets interrupted if we've uploaded the file, right? But you haven't gotten to the part 2, which is saving the rest of the form entry data, and then the user's network connection drops out. Now you have kind of an orphaned file scenario on the server. The scenarios like that, unfortunately, exist right now. My solution, one kind of hacky workaround to this is you can take the file the user had uploaded and base 64 encode that into a string send that to your server, and then base64 decode it and save it to the file system. But it's kind of a hacky workaround, in my view, and having native support there, I'm really looking forward to. So stay tuned for that to be added.
I need to go base64 a 1 gig video and just see what happens.
Yeah.
The nice part about that is it's client side, so you're not like overloading some server trying to base64 it, but it also would be slow for large files.
Yeah, but by base64 encoding, it bumps the size of the file, increases. It's like 130%, as large as the original, which is a bummer. Now you're sending more data across the wire than you even need to.
Yeah.
And then once it gets there, you have to do a bunch of checks, to make sure, like, is this the file type, the MIME type I expect, is it valid? Is the size what I expect or whatever before you actually save it? And you lose some of, the intended behavior of GraphQL, which is, you have the strongly typed schema, what everything is. So if you're, tricking it into thinking, oh yeah, here's the thing, it's just a string and I've typed it as such, as a string, when really it's just like a file that you've encoded into a string temporarily, that kind of thing. So looking forward to that native file upload support, definitely.
Right. Yeah. And base64 has a non-trivial amount of computational resources that would have to execute.
Yeah.
So
I mean, the larger your file
number
get, the
of those
more
might be an issue.
Yeah. And if you have people submitting stuff on their phone, they're going to be pissed off when you waste their battery life trying to encode a file.
That's a big file. That'd be fun.
This could be a live coding app for us. We could have an app called drainmybattery.com, and just you give it a file and it'll just base64 encode, decode, and then
you got a base64 that
That'll be great.
Generic. What is that bunny video? That's an MP4 that used to be like the thing you tested everything with.
Oh,
you know what I'm talking about? It's like this. I don't even know.
Hamster Dance.
I don't even know what the cartoon was, but
not Hamster Dance or one of those old.
It was like it looked like a Pixar thing with this giant bunny. I don't know, but everybody used it as like their example MP4 video. I'll have to post it somewhere. You say that that's going to be added to GraphQL to be able to upload files, but I don't know why, but it just like sets off a red flag in my mind of like having your one endpoint that is servicing your entire API. Now all of a sudden, like a DDoS attack on that thing, once you allow it to take, a 50 meg file, a gig file, whatever it is, would be pretty straightforward. Whereas if you create it as a separate endpoint, you can kind of separate those concerns. But that's just, we'll see what happens in that space. I would imagine we're going to need a setting in WPGraphQL for like at least file size that you can allow.
Right.
And then on your host as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. The best is you find an API, they need a file upload, you upload a 10 gig PNG, take down the server.
Right.
And you just hope that they're base64 in it.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see, what else do we have on here? Oh, well, we've already talked about that, REST is native to WordPress and WPGraphQL isn't. But at this point, like if you're doing headless, you got some plugins you got to install, and you're probably going to add WPGraphQL into that.
Yeah. The only thing I would say there is you might work in a corporation that is very stringent upon what they will and will not allow. And they may have a list of allowed plugins or something. And if WPGraphQL is not one of them, then you don't want to get in trouble by installing it and using it. And if that's the case, if you know PHP well enough, you can create your own kind of REST API to suit your needs better than the WordPress REST API. Otherwise, you can use the WordPress REST API. But I will say that the WordPress REST API is written in a way where it's very generic and it has to support every different use case that you might need. And because of that, it's not very, it doesn't perform very well under a lot of scenarios. So it takes a lot of tooling around with to make it work well. And sometimes it can be easier just to go in and create your own endpoints for the data you need.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
you can make it happen. You're just gonna do a lot more work Like you make it relatively quick. I don't think it'll ever be as quick as WPGraphQL out of the box. But yeah, you can do some clever things with limiting the fields and then batching things up. But yeah, definitely not going to be the simplest solution for you.
Yeah. So one more point on the native to WordPress speaking point here, and that is if you're just getting into headless, you may have a little like trepidation about using a third-party plugin like WP GraphQL. You may think, well, isn't it safe? Like if the REST API is built into WordPress into the platform, that's obviously not going anywhere. It's going to be supported long term, and it's here to stay or whatever. Shouldn't I use that? Shouldn't I tend to lean toward that instead of a third-party plugin that's not in core? And I've heard, first of all, like there's a large community and an ecosystem of extensions, and I have a lot of faith that WP GraphQL will be around for a long time. Even more than that, though, I've heard some of the maintainers of WP GraphQL. I've heard them say it's actually they view it as a good thing that WP GraphQL is not in WordPress core, because they feel that they're able to improve upon and iterate on the plugin at a faster rate than they could if it was in WordPress core. And as you can imagine, if you're working on WordPress core development, this is the platform powering 41% of the internet plus at this point. You have to be very scrupulous about everything that goes in, and there's very long approval cycles and review cycles and so on to get things actually into WordPress core. So many view that as actually a perk, that it's not native to WordPress and is a plugin that can be iterated upon very rapidly. So could be a perk.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like the rapid development is what's really nice about WP GraphQL. I know it's changed a lot even since I've started using it a year and a half ago. And it's just getting better. There's tons of stuff coming, like custom scalars I'm super pumped about, subscriptions. You hear that, Jason? Subscriptions. We need those. Any day now. I'm ready. But now I think we kind of reached the end of all of our points that we wanted to make on this. I think it's I feel pretty confident that at least the three of us would always use WP GraphQL as our default for a headless site. For WordPress, that's not to say that you can't ever use the REST API or shouldn't. I mean, it's totally possible. Plenty of people have built very large websites based on the REST API, and it can be done. But one thing that we didn't bring up here, the one last point, is developer experience. Like I really like the experience of being the client developer to a GraphQL API. Being able to go into the graphical editor, have that schema explorer, build my query out, and then just paste it into my code. All my queries are executed the same on the client side, and it's just a nice experience to be able to do that. And then add a field if I need it, or whatever needs to be done. It's just right there. There's like a good developer experience for it, which is super cool.
Yeah, the experience is definitely a lot nicer than reading through REST API documentation.
Yeah, it's self-documenting. Like we talk about, you want self-documenting code all the time, but GraphQL is actually very much self-documenting. Very cool. It's especially like we've gone in and we've created like a custom field or something on the schema, and you have to provide like a description, a name, so it asks you to provide these things about the schema that then get worked into the documentation. So it's super cool.
Yeah, you're not reduced to, in the REST world, maybe somebody has a better tool for documenting REST APIs, but you're creating your Swagger YAML or JSON file or code comments, and you have to make sure that every time you create an endpoint, you also create something, some piece in your documentation somewhere.
Right. Yeah, that is one of the nice things about GraphQL in general. Is like it's the difference between GraphQL APIs. It's far less than the difference between different REST APIs. So it's way more standard in that respect, and like what you can expect from it.
Yeah, there are differences. Some people will start an API and say like, I'm not going to use relay spec or something like that, and then eventually they'll use relay spec. But there are others, that will find a different route as well.
Right. 100%. All right. Well, that wraps up everything for me. You guys got any more last parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say, like, for anybody listening to this, if you're looking to get into Headless, and you're wondering which one is the easiest to get ramped up with, because maybe you don't have as much experience as some of the folks on the call here. I would say, like, for you, I would also recommend WPGraphQL. I think that's going to be easier. If you go with the REST API, you'll probably find pretty quickly that you need, either more data that endpoints or the currently existing endpoints are giving you. You have to make those subsequent requests that we talked about, which adds some complexity to your front end application and adds network latency you have to wait for, or that you're getting more data back than you need, and you're having to kind of pay the cost for querying for data that you don't actually need. So, and if you're not very well versed in PHP and making custom REST endpoints and so on, that'll probably be pretty cumbersome to be in that position. So I would say I would recommend doing WP GraphQL. In my mind, the big value of it is being able to query for what you need, nothing less, nothing more, as we've talked about, and just the strong developer experience, like we've talked about. Being able to compose your queries in a tool like Graphql, hit a button, execute, and see what you will get back. Things like that will make for a really nice user experience.
Yeah, you brought up one more point there that I like, is that if you don't know PHP, I would definitely go with GraphQL, because it has a really great plugin ecosystem too. Like there's, actually they baked it into custom post type UI where you can edit your WP GraphQL settings there, like exposure, post type, but there's things for gravity forms. There's things for ACF, like it's all there, and you can use these plugins and extensions to WP GraphQL to prevent you from having to go write any custom PHP, which is nice. And it's getting better over time. So if you don't know PHP, definitely go with GraphQL. All right. Well, this was a good episode. I think that this is something a lot of people think about when they're starting their headless sites, and something that you got to decide pretty quickly. Hopefully you take a look at WP GraphQL and choose it, because we really love it. But again, like we said at the beginning of the show, if you like this podcast and enjoy what you're getting, please go give it the top rating on your platform of choice. It really helps us to get views and discoverability of the podcast. Also, if you want to join the community, visit developers.wpengine.com. We have links to our Discord server, which we hope that you join in and join the community, ask questions, find other people that are building headless WordPress sites. We have the links to the podcast and all of our blogs and videos and all the content that our team is creating are out there. So go check that out. Join our community, use GraphQL today, and happy coding.